this is a very wonderful representation of diversity in the fire service. So this is kind of like knowing your audience, because it's important for you to know who's here today. So I had to write it down. We have 60 plus people registered with over 15 departments across the state. This is kind of where, actually, this is where internet is helping, because that's getting the word out for us. We have small departments, we have large departments, we have some departments with multiple people attending. We have paid people, we have volunteer people, we have women, we have men, firefighters all the way through the ranks of fire chiefs. We have training officers, we have HR civilians, we have a person who's IT, who raised a question about how is technology different for women in the fire service, or is it? We have a PIO. I'm sure I'm missing all the groups, but I think that just shows you how this is not just a women's subject. This is not just for women. It's for anybody who's interested in this topic, which today happens to be on integrated health. A little background of how this came to be. I'd like to claim that this was specifically because IAFF has made it Cancer Awareness Month. That just happens to be a lucky thing. But I also was thinking it's the new year, so people tend to look at their health. Also, I was unfortunate to have met Dr. Sarah Janke. So the fact that she just said yes, that's another reason why she's in charge of today's conversation. But no, last fall, Women in Fire did host a conference. So if you go to their website, you can actually watch the recordings. It's called The State of Science, and it breaks it down by different leading scientists on the health of firefighters. So this is kind of another extension, because obviously that was handled at the national level. So now we can bring it more local, maybe dig deeper into the conversation and really allow us to, like, get some of these human resource concerns out there. I feel today we are really gonna hear a lot and learn a lot, but I also know that after this is over, there's gonna be more questions that you may personally have, or you may have for your department. And hopefully this will help you go in that process and dig deeper for yourselves and for your organization. I also definitely need to give a shout out to the Virginia Fire Chiefs Association. So last year, this is the second meet and greet that we did. We had about 30 participants last October. And then after that meeting, as a result, one of the people on that meeting is from the Virginia Fire Chiefs Association, and he reached out to us, and we have created a partnership. So I think that's a great opportunity, because again, we're showing that this is something that's for everybody in the fire service, because it concerns all human resources. And so through them too, we were able to kind of market it to a bigger audience. So you will see, like I said, there are fire chiefs on this call. So I really am excited to see them involved today.
Brenda, not to cut you off, but Keith here. So I got on a few minutes late, but thank you for the shout out. So happy to have you, that partnership with the Women in Fire and so forth. And hopefully got a lot of our members signed up. And I know we got our board of directors signed up. So that is positive. Just welcome everybody. I certainly am due to take over at our February 16th meeting. I take over as president of the VFCA, so I'm excited about that, and focusing all the good work and working with this association very closely. So really looking forward to it. So thank you.
Thank you, Chief. So for those of you who don't know, Keith Johnson is not only the fire chief for Loudoun County Fire and Rescue, but he also is, he's part of, as you can see in his explanation, he's part of the Virginia Fire Chiefs Association. So we are very excited and honored to have him on this call today. So I want to, like I said, we have a lot to get into. Before I do that, and I just want to make sure I covered everything. So the format for today, we are going to start with Dr. Sarah Janke, who's going to, the thing is, there's so much about health. So she's going to condense it into like a 30-minute conversation. And then when she's finished, I don't know if she's going to log on. If not, our Deputy Chief, Tracy Reed from Fairfax, is going to speak a little bit to the Fairfax County's manual that's out there on reproductive health. And then from there, I'm going to have Battalion Chief Mike Johnson from Loudoun speak on what their organization has done through their Health and Safety Committee to kind of take it further in their organization since they've made women's health their theme for this year. And then once we finish that, we'll break out at that point, I will definitely have everybody allow them to raise hands and we'll get into that from there. So I think I'll stop with that. And for now, I just want to introduce all of you to Dr. Sarah Jenke. Very excited to have her. This woman has made, I think it looks at your resume like it's your life to be able to study firefighters and be a scientist on that. So she is the director and senior scientist with the Center for Fire Rescue and EMS Health Research at the National Development and Research Institute. She has been the principal investigator for over 10 national studies, as well as being on a dozen or so as co-investigator. Her range of health concerns include health of women firefighters, behavioral health, risk of injury, cancer, cardiovascular risk factors, and substance abuse use with funding from with funding from various organizations. She has more than 100 publications in peer-reviewed medical literature. So I think she definitely, you can say she would be a subject matter expert for today's conversation. And we are very honored to have her participate in today's events. And with that, I would love to turn it over to Dr. Sarah Jenke.
Well, I am so excited to be here. And Brenda, thank you so much for the invitation. And you've just been awesome getting this all together. And actually, I'll talk a little bit about the projects that we have going on that Fairfax and hopefully Loudoun, depending on timing, are going to be involved in. So I think to get the Virginia folks on board, I'm so excited because I think we can even expand this beyond those two departments a little bit wider. Anyway, yes, I love studying firefighter health, and I have to say that studying the health of women in the fire service has become, I would say, I'm enjoying it even more than just my firefighter health research. So I grew up around that. My dad retired as chief of Overland Park, Kansas, right outside of Kansas City. So that's how I got into this area of research. And so I've always it's like working with people I grew up with. So that part's fun. But once we got into studying women in the fire service, kind of actually was not the original plan. But as we started doing these large cohort studies, like our first one was 799 firefighters, 24 departments, all in Missouri Valley. And we had like about 50 women that were in it. And so we were starting to publish all these articles. And it was originally on cardiovascular health, risk for injury. And given the differences in gender that you would expect, we were trying to publish with like, here's what we know, about men, here's women. And the authors or the editors would always say like, well, we need you to either make a statistical comparison, which the sample size wasn't large enough, or we need you to take the women out of the study and we'll just publish it on men. So as we talked to other researchers, like that was the same issue that we were starting to see that they were starting to get when they published it. And I think individual editors, I don't think any one editor was thinking like, this is really limiting even the basic stuff that's out there on women. I think they each saw it as for each article in terms of we can't make statistical comparisons, blah, blah, blah. But it resulted in kind of an interesting and disturbing trend of great research being done on only males in fire service. So we designed our first study where we did both qualitative and quantitative. And it was actually got funded by National Institutes of Health, which is awesome because they're really difficult to get funding with, but they saw the low rate of women in the fire service as definitely something that needed to be looked into in terms of health impact and how not knowing anything about the health of women in the fire service has impacted, both recruitment and retention. So awesome line of research. I've met like the most amazing women. Tiffany and I were commenting when we first got on that I tagged her as a glass ceiling breaker in my Facebook feed yesterday. And it's just some really amazing human beings. So honored to do it, honored to be here and presenting today. And Brenda said I have 30 minutes to get in everything that we know. And as you can tell by my kind of just can't stop talking in my excitement about this topic, but it's going to be a little difficult. So I'll go fast. If you have questions, feel free to jot them down and I can answer them, anytime I give my contact information at the end. But can everyone see my screen on this slide? Okay, perfect. So a little bit about if I can advance my slide. There we go. So it's no surprise to the people on this call that there's a low rate of women in the fire service, but often when I'm presenting data to groups that are less familiar, you ask, so how do you think women in the fire service compare to other groups that are typically male dominated? They say, oh, I think we're about the same, which is just not accurate. So 13% of police, 14% of military. Marine Corps, where everyone's required to be combat ready, is 6%. And the rates at the time I pulled these numbers were between 3.5% and 5%. And so there's something that, and this is why I think NIH was interested in it, there's something that's specific to the fire service that really discourages the entry and retention of women. So that's one of the things that we just wanted to look into it. And what is that? I think partly there's a lot that we don't know about the health of women. And that's what we heard in our qualitative piece when we first started doing this work, that, one, not researching women also kind of gives them or places less value on them. And that's why I'm thrilled to see, if I can say FEMA, through their assistance to firefighter grants, R&D stuff, they now require you to specifically talk about how you're going to recruit women, and not just, oh, we're going to recruit, it's 5%, so we'll hope to have 5% of our sample. How are you going to go over and above to make sure that women are represented? And they've actually funded our work, a previous study and a current study, that the one I'll talk about at the end, to look specifically at health of women in the fire service. And it's awesome that they're doing that, but I think it also speaks to kind of the value that we're starting to see the National Fire Service place on diversity. So specific to reproductive health, very little's known about either the occupational exposure of mothers, child health impact, and we still don't know a ton about child health impact, although I can talk about what we think we do know. And the concerns looking at reproductive health are kind of across the board, like not surprisingly, chemical, biological exposures. We know that there was been discussion about that, but also the shift work, which we can't do away with shift work, but I think the more we learn about the impact of interrupted circadian rhythms and the impact of shift work on overall health, I think it makes it even more important to prioritize that. And then just the physiological strain of firefighting in high ambient temperature and noise. So I'm going to say the publications were early 90s. I think the one I'm thinking of in particular, some great work by Dr. McDermott out of Canada and IAFF, where they basically outlined the reproductive health concerns for women in the fire service, and basically said, we don't know. These are the things we think are going to be a concern based on what we see in other populations and other more mechanistic studies. But these are things that should be researched more. And then there really hasn't been more research on it until recently. And now we're really starting to dig into this. We did two studies that were survey studies, and I'll report on that. But there are a couple other studies going on right now that are starting to look at things like AMH. So that's looking at a marker of hormones that's related to menopause. So they're finding, or we think through pilot data, that we're finding that women firefighters are more likely to hit menopause earlier, likely because of some of the exposures that they have. Some of the exposures of concern in terms of what we actually have found. So Kenny Finn's done some awesome work, Gavin Horn, Denise Smith, where they measure toxicants on the fire ground and carcinogens. And these are some of them that are specifically have been found in fires that we believe are related to kind of have reproductive health implications. So if you think about, if not that anyone needs, especially in Cancer Awareness Month, one more reason to be motivated to, clean gear, take showers in an hour, all those types of things. I think the fact that all these exposures, that many of the exposures that have implications as carcinogens also have implications for reproductive health. So our study that I mentioned that we did some qualitative, we did focus groups and interviews. We had a guided discussion, and overall we had, a lot of them were interviews, and then we had a couple of focus groups so we could get some interaction. 46 female firefighters, 43 fire service leaders, and we looked at men and women in fire service in those leadership sort of interviews, because, and I think I discussed this with Brenda earlier, that I think I was surprised at some of the people in key leadership positions who just would say, honestly, Sarah, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm maybe not the person to ask. And I think as we move forward, I think that was the exact thing that I needed to know, because the fact that some folks that are in key leadership positions aren't aware of some of this stuff, I think speaks to the information that needs to be shared, like where we need to go and the things we need to focus on moving forward. Because if you're in key leadership position and you've never thought about, miscarriage or some of these things and the health implications for men in the fire service, given the same environment, I think it's some stuff that we need to obviously amplify. So what we found specific, and the study was overall health, but we did talk specifically about reproductive health because we were interested in what people thought about that and what men and women and women who are firefighters thought about it. And we did find reproductive health is a major concern. And I've been shocked at the number of emails I've gotten or people that have reached out via social media where they say, I've been looking for research on this topic, pregnancy or miscarriage, breastfeeding, and there's nothing out there. Can you direct me to where that data is? And I'm like, well, I can direct you to where the data isn't, but and I can give what we do have so far. But it's a major concern, and there's not a ton of stuff out there. One of the things Brenda mentioned that we can, if there are questions and resource needs, one of the projects that we have going on right now with Women in Fire is to basically pull together a stakeholder panel. We've got we have women in the fire service, we have leaders, we have some physicians. We're working on getting a couple OBGYNs, which if anyone has anyone that they can think of that they really like, or if they have an OBGYN who would have, some insights into what questions there are, we're trying to pull those together so we can share, here's the data we do have, here's the things we want OBGYNs to be thinking about, and kind of like a resource hub for women who have reproductive health concerns. So if you know of anyone, if you want to be on the stakeholder panel, again, at the end, I'll share some contact information. I'd love to reach out, or through Brenda, get in touch, because we're currently building that stakeholder panel. But like I said, reproductive health, major concern. The kind of 5 themes that we saw emerge was discussions around pregnancy policy, decision-making by firefighters for disclosure of pregnancy, which we have some interesting data on that I'll share. And then just a lack of education and research. There's not a ton of stuff out there, and women didn't necessarily know what to take to their OBs when they were pregnant. And it was interesting because I was pregnant when we were doing this study. And so I talked to my OB and I'm like, hey, I have a question, random question. If I were a firefighter, what would you tell me? And she goes, I'd probably go look for the national guidelines. And I'm like, what if there are no national guidelines? Because I'd looked like at ACOG, the group that she's a member of. And she said, we just, until you don't feel comfortable doing it anymore, then you could go, you could not work. And I'm like, that just leaves a lot open. And I think if I love my OB and she's very conservative. And I think if she knew exactly what a firefighter was exposed to, there's no way she would have been comfortable without having a conversation at least about that. Although, then the decision would be we want to make sure women can have an informed decision with their provider. There was talk about how reproductive health concerns may impact recruitment and retention. And then we did get some women who were like, my department handled it beautifully, and this is what they did. So in terms of department variation, there were a lot of departments that said, a lot of women who said my department doesn't have anything. There are some recommendations within 1582 about what that could look like. A lot said there were no policies, and some said that they had policies that just were really, really unfavorable. And one of the questions that I know Brenda and I had discussed was like, who's the best person to make that policy? I can tell you from this stuff from our data collection who the worst person is to make that policy, and it's the first woman to get pregnant in the department. We heard a lot of stories about. A lot of chiefs, a lot of the leadership folks would say, I never thought of it until it happened. And so then I said, what would you like the policy to be? But it also created this really, and a couple of the women described very supportive departments that, they were able to come up with a policy and it worked out well. But there were a lot who said, I was charged with making the policy, but then everyone's like, oh, you're just trying to get out of work. You're just trying to, then it became this like push pull with colleagues and other firefighters and women having to justify it, especially without data, when they should go on light duty or what that should look like. And so I think especially with departments that are saying, we really want more women in our department. one of my big statements to them is then have a department that is friendly to women when you walk in the door, that you have the policies in place, that it's not like, okay, you're welcome here, and then if you get pregnant, then I'm going to need you to figure that out. Like, have a proactive policy. So I don't know who the best person is, but I can tell you who the worst person is. A lot of discussion. This was really, we asked, and we have some survey data about when women shared with their departments that they were pregnant. This is, I think, the only time that I can think of in a focus group that I actually thought I was going to see physical violence between two participants. Because we had one woman who said, I'd miscarried 3 times. The minute I found out I was pregnant, I went to the department and I said, I have to be off the truck. To another woman in the same focus group in the same department who said, she said, I worked my ass off to get where I'm at. I did not want to give up one moment. And she's like, what does that say? If I go on late duty and I love my job. She's like, I fought a fire the day before I delivered, and it was a huge fire. And they were like, oh, that's not safe. No, you're giving women in the department a bad name because everyone's going to think you're just, getting pregnant just to be off the job. So it was, and finally I'm like, okay, we're just gonna take a breath and move on to the next question. But it was really interesting. And it was interesting to see the dynamics within the same department where, and you do have, legally women have the choice between them and their physician on when they want to, when they want to change job duties, if they can do the job. They have to be allowed to do the job. On the other hand, now that we're starting to see some of this data, and that's where I don't want to make decisions for women. I just want women to have the data so they can make data-based decisions. Lack of education and research and just information. Again, like I mentioned, both for firefighters to know, like, what are the risks that I'm facing so they can do that with open eyes. And then also for providers. And I think we're dealing with this on all fronts. Like right now we have the IAFC and the FRCE, First Responder Center of Excellence, have this like one pager that firefighters can take to their physician. And I think one of the things that I see, like when I do presumptive expert testimonies, is often reading medical records. Firefighters will be going to the doctor for symptoms for quite a while before the doctor goes, we should check this for cancer. And because they don't realize, this is a firefighter who probably is at increased risk. So that's what that kind of document is for. So you can go to a doctor and say, just so you know, this is the other stuff that I'm kind of dealing with in daily life. That is, I think, what we need to create for OBGYNs. So they can look at it and say, okay, so these are, if you're on the truck, these are the possible exposures. These are the things that we need to be looking for. And a couple of departments have done a really nice job of creating that. Fairfax County has an awesome policy. When people ask what policy I'd point to as a good one, that's the one I always refer to. And they have a great kind of guide about what that looks like, what it looks like to be on the job. So I think education kind of on both sides, and education on and I have a lot of sympathy for leaders who are like, I don't want to screw this up. I'm a chief and I don't want to screw this up for my firefighter. I don't want to screw this up for the offspring of my firefighter. So I respect that too. But I think, the more data we can get, the more we can put it in a usable format, the better off I think we'll be. And then the impact on recruitment and retention. I mean, women did talk about some of it kind of the stress of being a mom on the job, and is it different than being a dad on the job? But then also, what's it viewed like if you get pregnant? What is your crew? There's some crews that we heard about that were really fantastic and supportive and excited for the woman, and then other crews where they took it as like a personal affront that how dare you get pregnant. And we actually, so speaking to the mom issue though, we just had, in fact, I have to review this morning, published an article looking or drafted a manuscript looking at the impact for moms on the job. And if they were, one, it did impact overall health and kind of mental health, and because of the stress. And they obviously, like, doesn't take a scientist to tell you that there was some role strain between being a firefighter and being a mom. But it also, they actually were no more likely to like experience depression, post-traumatic stress symptoms, anxiety, and their job satisfaction was not, they were no more or less satisfied with their job than, so it's not, so while there was this concern that maybe it would, you know, drain them for work, actually, we didn't find that. So I thought that was kind of cool. They were less likely to binge drink was the one difference. It actually was favored them in that way, which as a mom of young children, I think that encourages my binge drinking. But when we ask questions in the quantitative part, does your department have a policy related to pregnancy and to maternity leave? At first I tend to think, okay, anytime the answer is yes more than it's no, we're headed in the right direction. But department, almost a quarter did not have a department or policy related to pregnancy. Now we didn't survey departments, we surveyed women. So it could be that a whole bunch from one department said that they didn't, but still concerning because that seems kind of like a basic HR policy that should be in place, both for pregnancy and maternity leave. And the other thing that we did wrong in this, you put out a survey and then the minute you start analyzing data, you realize all the stuff that you missed. And so we asked if they had a policy without asking what it was or if it was, a plus or a minus. Turns out there are a lot of places that have policies, but they're not good policies. And I don't know who caught this. It was, I want to say like 2018. Yeah, 2018 that this really became like it became a big headline of like really around the country that there was a policy about pregnancy. And it was that because it was not considered like an on-the-job injury, they had a policy that in that department that if you got injured and it wasn't on the job, you had to take, like you couldn't go on light duty, you couldn't, unless you couldn't go on light duty. And I think if you needed time off, you had to take just your vacation time. So, so they considered pregnancy like an injury. And so they required her to stay on the truck until she delivered. And this is always I always say, if the way around this is to just get pregnant while you're on duty and then see if they consider it an on-duty injury. But no one that I know of has taken me up on that, testing it that way yet. But so we know how many have policies, but we don't necessarily know how many have good policies. When we ask women about when they reported their pregnancy, most reported at the end of the first trimester, and then restricted duties second or third trimester. 10% didn't restrict duties at all. Now the challenge with that is when the baby is and the fetus is at highest risk is that first 12 weeks. So that's when the teratogen exposure is really acute and can cause some problems. So I mentioned that we're going to talk a little bit about child health, what we do and don't know. There was a study out of Washington that was an EFO report where they had an unusually high rate of cancer among children of firefighters. Now it was all males, I think, in that department. We don't know what impact, I can tell you birth outcomes for pregnancies that occur on duty, but we don't know the impact on child health from women or men in the fire service. So that EFO report is often cited as like one we need to, I think it's a great hypothesis. It was just a descriptive report, but I think it's a great hypothesis. We actually have put together a team, NIOSH, we've got University of Arizona, BYU, and University of Miami that we're trying to get funding to look at this, to do an epigenetic study, and then also a large epidemiologic study to look at the health of kids from firefighters, men and women. So the other cool thing about this is all the work we've done on reproductive health of women in the fire service, we're now starting to look at men in the fire service because it's not like men don't have reproductive health issues and some of the same implications and endocrine disrupting chemicals that they're exposed to. So there is some preliminary, we don't know, like I said, we don't know that this is the case, but there is a hypothesis that it might impact the health of children. So cancer might be one of the things, and but some of the other things, when we did our team meetings, we're talking to child health folks and talking through like, here's what firefighters are exposed to. And they said, oh yeah, I would expect to see like higher rates of autism spectrum disorders, attention deficit, those types of things for men and women, just given what the, given what firefighters are exposed to and what the children will be exposed to in utero, which is interesting. But in terms of big picture, I think we just need to keep in mind that there could be some of those early exposures that could have some implications. So we looked at our survey data, again, didn't expect this finding. So we currently have a publication, a dissertation that asks in 3 different ways what we're seeing with women on a larger scale, but we did find higher rates of miscarriage. So when you looked across pregnancies, I think we did the first, second, and third pregnancies and looked at the outcome of those. Women that were firefighters were, when we compared to general population, which is about 10 across all pregnancies, about 2.3 times higher rate of miscarriage. Now, this was alarming, and I was hoping that I was wrong with the data or that there was something about the sample, but we just replicated it. And then I saw the manuscript she's putting together right now, and she found really similar results in the data set we have. So interesting thing from that data set, though, because this was all career women, and her statisticians were looking at it, so I say don't quote me on this, but like it's recorded, so it is quoting me on this. So I'll just say it's preliminary data, and it hasn't been published yet in the peer-reviewed literature, but she actually looked at, compared career and volunteer and found that women in the volunteer fire service were even more likely to miscarry than women in the career fire service. So we're trying to think through that, and if it's, that they don't see it as something that they need to restrict as early because it's not a full-time job. I don't know. And if you have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. But it was an interesting finding that we were not expecting to see. And we haven't looked yet about policies in volunteer versus career, and it could be that there are fewer policies around limiting work. I don't know. If you have thoughts, I'm totally open to them, because I was really actually shocked with the result. The other thing we saw was preterm births, so before 37 weeks, was statistically significant in terms of how often that occurred. So 11 to 16%, depending on which pregnancy it was. In the fire service, the national average was right around 9.6. We didn't have questions specific to what if they were still fighting fires, where they restricted the week that they restricted duty. We just had trimesters, so we weren't able to look at that. And another question we get quite a bit is breastfeeding. And this is pilot data that Jeff Burgess out of Arizona published. He didn't publish it. He did not publish this. This was a very small sample. But he looked at in 2015 for, I think, Phoenix Fire Department. And he found that there were still persistent carcinogens in the breast milk at 72 hours post-fire. So we decided so his initial recommendation was pump and dump for 72 hours. Now, with the larger scale study that he did, he said, it could be anything. It could be that it was just a blip. It was a woman who had happened to be around, some other environmental toxicant, something like that. And so we decided to do a larger study, and also compared. So we recruited for this when we got breast milk, when they hadn't been fire exposed, and then immediately after 8 hours, 24, 72, repeated that, but then also got women who were in the same area, like a friend of theirs that was breastfeeding, and got their breast milk. So we were able to compare. I don't have the data to share on that because, again, his is very preliminary and hasn't been published yet, and I don't want to share it until in any public way until he has a peer-reviewed publication on it. But he was finding that it was still there 72 hours later. In terms of recommendations, his preliminary recommendation to when we talked about it was, you've got to know there's still chemicals 72 hours. We didn't go beyond that, so we don't know when they go away. Maybe if women who are breastfeeding and fighting fires, we don't know how long to tell you to pump and dump. So then that's another for the women in fire. Once we get that in a peer review publication, we're going to need to think around, one, education, but then two, what are the implications of that? Breastfeeding is an interesting topic because departments by law are required to accommodate, as I truly believe they should be, And then there's all this confusion when this conversation comes up, though, around for a lot of the men that I've talked to who are like, so we have to accommodate, like, why can't they just time it and only, if we're at a fire, why, if they have to pump, then they're like, can't they just like basically hold it? And I'm like, you clearly have never breastfed. So there are a lot of interesting questions around that. And just the other thing is when I say pump and dump in at presentations and mixed crowds, I get a lot of really confused looks. And so I think just some basic education around like what breastfeeding, how breastfeeding works, and what it means to pump and dump, those types of things, I think are another education piece that we'll be able to do some nice, get some nice data out there and some resources. Oh, and I know I keep saying that I really, or we're waiting for peer review publications. There's a lot of great data out there, but the reason I value peer reviewed so much is that sometimes as a scientist, you get tunnel vision and you think that you see something in your data, and then you put it through the peer review process where it goes out to a couple other scientists, and you'll get people that say like, well, but you didn't think about this, or that, this analysis is off, and it could be. So I'm a huge believer in, putting most of my faith in peer review publications before any decisions, policy or otherwise, are made, just because I think that, especially for stuff like this, we're talking like big major decisions that have an impact on someone's day-to-day life. And we don't want to make this, if someone is to review Jeff's peer-reviewed paper and go, oh, but what about, because they'll send it to someone who has expertise in breast milk analysis. We don't want to make decisions before their time. But I think we should, just as preliminary data warrants caution. Now, in terms of breast cancer, because it is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, or it is Cancer Awareness Month for Fire Service. And I think Brenda said Virginia does include breast cancer in their list of presumptive cancers. We don't have great data on breast cancer in women firefighters in terms of like a large epi study, and I do think that that's coming. So I think it's going to be probably later this year, the National Firefighter Registry is going to be launching. Another question I have for this team, and I realize I'm coming with just about as many questions as I am answers on data, but one of the big questions we have is how can we get as many women as possible enrolled in that? Because they are looking to enroll like 100,000 firefighters. I don't want to see 5% of those women. I want to see like 25% of those women. I want to get as many women into that, and they want to get as many women into that registry as possible. So if we can, another question that I'd love feedback on, how do we reach as many women, educate them on what's needed, make sure that they're in there. The one sticking point that I am quick to bring up early on in the process and conversation about this, because it's all, people can self-select into it, and it's individual, it is going to be asking for social security numbers. The reason for that is it will link to cancer registries, and it'll link to death certificates. So once you enroll, give your social security number, it'll follow you literally until the day you die. Your registry is put in there. So I've talked to the team, I'm on their panel of whatever it is, but we want all firefighters that we can get to enroll in this, but I want to educate, and we need as much help as we can educating women and the fire service that here's the reason why, and I completely understand why handing NIOSH your social security number seems a bit scary, but that's the only way we're going to be able to get some accurate numbers. And without that, we can't find out what happened to firefighters when they die. Because the problem is, a lot of times you go in and people in cancer registries are listed as retired. Well, they could have been listed as retired, but spent 30 years in the fire service. So anyway, what we do know about breast cancer, this group out of San Francisco has done an awesome job studying kind of like the mechanistic approach to breast cancer. And they put together this environmental health article is fantastic. They also put together and have allowed me to share a report that they did through Silent Spring Institute, basically outlining here's what we do know about what women are exposed to. And while we don't have the epi data to support it, we do know mechanistically, this is why we are not surprised by what we believe are higher rates of breast cancer in the fire service. There was a study that looked at it that of course, it was of men, and it found a higher rate of breast cancer for men in the fire service. And given how much more frequently it is found in women, I think, it's not a leap. But a lot of, in fact, Colorado just added it to their trust based on reports like this. So it's awesome that Virginia already has that on board. Now, like I mentioned, there's what we're learning about women has some really, for once, the science is ahead on the women's side of things, and we're starting to go, okay, what about the reproductive health of men in the fire service? This study came out just last year, 2019, and it looked at infertility in a cohort of male Danish firefighters, and they found that when they looked at people accessing reproductive health and infertility treatments, that men that were firefighters were 46% more likely to be getting infertility treatments with their spouse than non-firefighters. They have like this awesome data set because they collect everything in a national registry. But so I think it's easy, and people say, oh, we have to be careful talking about reproductive health of women because then are people going to say women shouldn't be firefighters? And my response to that is men also have reproductive health concerns, and we really think, again, we proposed a study for this one. And it's wrapped in with the child health one, so we can kind of know more about that. It hasn't been funded yet, but the team is like dedicated to eventually getting this funded. So we'll know more. But they think that one of the hypotheses is that it could be fire exposure. So one of the things we want to look at is sperm pre-fire exposure and post, like new recruits, and then looking at sperm later, because they think that there's some epigenetic changes from being fire exposed. So a lot of times in presentations, when I talk about reproductive health, people, a lot of the men in the audience, their eyes kind of glaze over until I start going, and it could affect your sperm. And then people are like, oh, wait. Let's talk about that. So some questions that Brenda had for me, and I know I'm getting close on time, but do's and don'ts while pregnant on shift. I'm going to say that that's one of the questions that we have open, and one of the questions we'd like feedback on. And through the Women in Fire Project, we're going to try to do. I do think it needs to be an individual decision, but I think it also needs to be an informed individual decision. I would say I personally, based on the miscarriage data, if I found out I was pregnant and was a firefighter, I would go on light duty as soon as possible. One of the challenges in a lot of departments we heard, though, is that, and this is why I want to get ahead of this, is that women that were put on light duty were put on just like some meaningless, okay, answer the phone call, like your light duty assignment. And I realize it's different for different departments, and it can be challenging to find like important light duty positions, but pregnant women don't all of a sudden lose all their skills. They have skills that can be used in another setting, and their skills don't go from, being a fantastic firefighter and being, a motivator, which is a lot of times what we found with women who were in the fire service, to like, my only skill is I can answer the phone. No, so I think also getting ahead of and having people think about how can women who are pregnant, if they're doing, if they're trying to protect their unborn child, how can they still, make valuable contributions? And there are departments that have done that fantastically well. So I think we need to find those departments and amplify their methods and approach. Another question Brenda had said was, how can we show being, or Rachel had said, sorry, how can we show being a woman in the fire department brings a positive effect? This is, I think, our question around diversity and inclusion in general. And I think we need to start shifting the conversation. One, what being in the fire service and what being a firefighter means and what the day-to-day tasks of that are hugely different today than they were 100 years ago. Most calls are not fires. That's what, 5% now. But I think the other thing that we need to think about is, people will say, well, like women can't do the job. She couldn't pull me out. Could she pull me out of the basement if I went down? So my answer to that is, well, probably yes, because we've looked at the health of women in the fire service, and they are far fitter and like lower rates of obesity, in general, healthier than men in the fire service when we looked at large scale. So yeah, they tend to be pretty fit, pretty badass women. And the other thing is, you look at, no one ever says they're all protective around, that guy that can break down the door, right? Well, and I'm like, well, we just pulled his data and he can barely, untie his shoes, but he found a role for him. Like, if you need to crawl under a bed to get a kid out, the guy who broke down the door and then is gassed for the entire rest of the fire can't do that. So I think we need to start thinking, like, even on the fire round, different people have different jobs. There's spots that a small stature man or a smaller woman can get into that the guy who broke down the door and now is done for the rest of the fire can't. And also, it's outside. I mean, we just know that more diversity creates more. And I understand that it's scary to think that it creates more ways to look at topics and more ways to look at challenges. Sometimes when you go out into the community for those 95% of calls, when you show up on a domestic violence call, you maybe don't want another man to walk in there and try to take control of the situation. Maybe there's something about having another woman in the room that can kind of help offset that. So I think those are some things to think about. And the other side of it is, I think the time where that's acceptable, that, oh, we're going to keep this all male because it's always been all male, and we're going to, whether it's purposeful or not, and I think a lot of times it's not purposeful. Sometimes it is, but I think sometimes it's not. I'm based right outside of Kansas City, and if anyone's been following the news about Kansas City, the Kansas City Star just did a year-long investigation on the issues with diversity and inclusion in Kansas City. And I think if nothing else, if just the benefit for the overall fire service isn't motivating, I think the fact that things like local papers doing huge exposés on your organization failing on diversity and inclusion issues and recruitment and retention, I think is a motivator. You don't want to be, I just talked to Chief, like, you do not want to be in the front page of the paper as a fire chief with that question. It's been a rough go, and she's new to the position. She's doing a fantastic job, but she's getting a lot of heat. So, and her department is, and it's not just her, it's everyone there. And then I thought the last question was an awesome one in terms of technology needs differ from male responders. And I didn't know the answer to this question, but I put it up because I think it's a great conversation to have. I know that we know, and I have some other presentations on things like injury. We know that that gear is actually related, ill-fitting gear, which a lot of women report, is related to injury. I think we probably will see the same thing with men who don't feel like their gear fits. But so I think paying attention to, how equipment is on a person, I think is also another important thing. So we can discuss that in breakout rooms. But I did say, I'd mentioned the current studies we have going. Like I mentioned, hopefully Loudoun and Fairfax are in this. We're looking at causes of looking both at stress and then exposures. So looking at for new recruits before they're fire exposed, after fire exposed, and then incumbent women in the fire service, and looking at biomarkers of cancer risk, and then looking at those across time. But the other part that I think is really fantastic is developing beta testing and assessing the feasibility of a peer support intervention. We have, again, another set of data that I love to present, but it's on women who've experienced discrimination and harassment, and the fact that there are very real and measurable mental health and physical health impacts of that. And what we found was that a lot of women feel like they're excluded from kind of the benefit and resilience building of that, like, kitchen table approach. And so one of our stakeholders called it like a virtual kitchen table. Like, how do we build networks like this and make sure that everyone is supported, whether it be women, whether it be ethnic minorities, whether it be whatever groups don't feel like they get that resilience building support in the firehouse, how can we get that to them? So that's what I have. My email's there. My Twitter, which I am trying to put more out on Twitter, is there, and our center has a page too. My cell phone's there, although I don't answer numbers that I don't know, so text me first if you're going to call. And then if you can either scan with your camera or email Hannah Kelly at that email address. If you want, as we disseminate data, we are creating a list, and we're trying to get more disseminable, useful stuff out. We're creating like a virtual magazine that you can look at studies as they come out that make it more user-friendly than maybe looking at the peer-reviewed publications. So that's the contact information. And again, if you have suggestions on how we message some of the stuff that we have, if you want to be involved in the stakeholder panel for the Women in Fire project, anything, we're just happy happy to get feedback and happy to, all of our research questions have come from women going, hey, what data is out there about? So if you have a question about what data is out there about something, it's probably not, and we probably should research it. So, and I think that's all I have. I'll stop.
Okay, great. Can you take a breath now, Sarah? Because yeah, take some coffee. You've been talking. Wonderful. I mean, seriously, there is so much information out there and so much more questions as we had. Like I said, we're all going to go away from this. I did, like, this is sort of like, we're going to be flexible with our format. So I'm not sure how much it's going to take to get to the next part. Real quick, what I'm going to do is, so Tracy Reed, who is our deputy chief from Fairfax, it turned out she was not able to make it, but I did want to take, I don't want to get into lots of stories because especially, you know, obviously I don't have kids, but other women obviously on this call do, but I will just share her story in particular, just because this is about 10 years ago when she got pregnant. There was a manual at that time, and obviously women before her had kids in the fire service. Some of the takeaways, though, in general, that I'm going to share with you from her experience was just the fact that it felt like a very confused process for her, as if she was the first and only woman in the department who ever was pregnant. The other part was, and I feel this is a very important key for chiefs to think about, and everybody, is she was very fortunate when she did go on light duty that she actually says that being pregnant actually changed her trajectory, because instead of being a woman who just was put into position to answer phones, she was matched up and put into a good situation, which actually set her up for her next part of her career. And she was able to take a lot of classes in the fire service and meet very key people in the office. And so she credits actually that as a lucky turn of fate for her. Also looking at that policy, there was a version, like I said, but she sort of, along with a woman named Annette Corwin, decided to take on the next chapter. And so there is a second version that she kind of addressed. I think right now, I don't know what version we're at, but like, clearly there's another version since that's 10 years ago. But, you know, trying to address all the different parts that Sarah pointed out, you know, you have to have the conversation with the doctor, figuring out when you're going to go out on light duty, you know, the FMLA, all the different things. So obviously it's I guess the point is, if you do have a manual, if you don't have a manual, it's going to continually be a evolving manual. It's never going to stop with the version that's created as things change. With breastfeeding being added, that wasn't a law back then. So obviously it's now been incorporated. It's something that needs to be considered. Another point, which I feel, because this still to me was a question I had asked Sarah about the advocacy part. You know, Fairfax being a bigger department, you know, there may be several women pregnant at once versus a small department where a woman might be pregnant every couple of years. But in that case, back then, there was a woman in their HR who was a big advocate, clearly knew the FMLA portion of the back and forth. And that woman took it upon herself to be the point person for the women, so that like she would ensure that they had all the FMLA information. She made sure that a refrigerator was sent to the fire service. She sent them cards. She had a flyer created so that previous women who had been pregnant could be contacted to be another support person. So if you had questions, hey, call this person up. Unfortunately, that woman left that position in our department and is, I think, somewhere else in the county. And the next person that came in said, well, that's not my job. So that nice of you didn't continue. And the other thing that that was mentioned was that it felt like as the pregnant woman, the responsibility was put on the woman. I.e. things like, well, as your pregnancy continues, now you have to go to the gear shop to get bigger gear, get bigger uniforms. And you're still figuring all these things and navigating these things all by yourself. Even though there's a manual, there's still, you know, it's still kind of on you. So that's pretty much, I think, her conversation to me in a nutshell. I also want to turn over to real quick here, Battalion Chief Johnson weigh in, if you would. Last year, I was doing lots of conversations, not lots, but before COVID, I was trying to get out and do some awareness about women in fire. And I met him at an event, and he asked me to speak to the Health and Safety Committee for Loudoun County. So just kind of wanted him to share from how that conversation went last fall to what they're doing looking at women's health. So Chief,
Hey, Brenda, thank you very much, and glad to be here. And I appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to me and what we're doing here in Loudoun County. So originally, I had heard Brenda's presentation at Nova Command Training, and when I'm sitting through the presentation, I'm thinking to myself, all right, what's Loudoun County doing right now when it comes to the department and our systems volunteer members? What are we lacking, of course? So then I walked away as at the time the chair of our systems health and wellness committee, thinking, okay, what can we do about this? Brenda and I were going to try to connect earlier in 2020, but then COVID came along and kind of pushed that back. And then fortunately, we were able to meet with her in June of last summer, where she gave the presentation to our systems health and safety committee. She went over all the different topics, was very informative, very detailed. And as I'm sitting through the presentation, I'm thinking to myself, once again, that this is something that we need to, as our committee, need to make a priority for 2021. So with that, like Brenda had mentioned earlier in the morning, our committee unanimously agreed that, hey, we want to make this our theme for 2021. So fortunately for us, with System Chief Johnson, he has made it publicly known. He feels that the health and wellness of our members is a priority. So we had our Health and Safety Committee meeting later in the year. Went very well. We agreed. And then we had a follow-up meeting, which was a brainstorming session. Brenda was a part of that. And then from there, one of the first priorities that we want to do is draft a white paper. The white paper is going to have various topics in it. Chief Johnson's aware, Assistant Chief Cawson, who oversees our section, is in full support of this. And then also with some transfers going on, the new chiefs coming in to key positions or already have been briefed in full support of that. So luckily in this white paper, we're going to address various topics, and once approved, we're going to splinter out into work groups. And with these work groups, we're very fortunate to have a robust membership with our career and volunteer members. The work groups will include our county risk management, local 3756 representation, fire and rescues HR. We even have Elsa on this great meet right now, so we're very fortunate to have her as part of that. Beth Flaherty is our behavioral health coordinator, Taylor Goodman, our wellness manager, and then Dr. Deba as our occupational health physician. So we're very fortunate to have a lot of folks that's going to be part of this. Then as we move forward, we want to start looking at key areas, behavioral health. Beth Flaherty, our behavioral health coordinator, she'll probably be that group lead that will maybe first send out a survey that wants to better gauge the work they need to do when it comes into certain topics. When we want to look at menopause, miscarriages, breastfeeding, the struggles that our female members are facing in our community, we want to be able to work on that and address that. And then also look at social media avenues that can connect our members internally, but also have them be able to reach out to their peers throughout the nation. So that's one component of it, will be the behavioral health. And then also with Taylor Goodman as our wellness center manager, we want to look at overall physical wellness. During pregnancy, working with our members to help them be prepared to re-enter into operational status. So we're very fortunate we can utilize we have a small group of peer fitness trainers, but we're looking to increase those numbers by 31 over the next 6 months. So under Taylor Goodman's direction, we'll be able to help our members throughout that process to help them with their overall physical wellness. And then we need to look at pregnancy, breastfeeding, and expressing milk while on duty. So that's where, we start looking at county HR, we look at risk management. We want to look at and review appropriate laws and policies, the applicable standards. And then we also want to look at what we're doing currently, our TRD policy, which, Sarah mentioned earlier in her presentation, and even some of the discussions we had internally about this matter, it's becoming a very sensitive topic. When should when should that person come off duty? Their choice, you name it. There's going to be a lot of sensitivity to that. So we want to make sure that we do a good job with that. And then also being in a combination system, We have county policies and sometimes department policies that provide oversight and guidance for our career employees, but sometimes there's going to be a weakness or a lack of policy and procedures for our volunteer members. So as we work through this whole process, we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing for all of our members, to include expressing milk while they're on duty, but also the emergency incident scene. So those are some of the things that we're probably not doing a good job at, and then we need to do better. And then, of course, with those topics, we want to make sure that we have a lot of adequate and factual educational materials, training material for the entire workforce, not just the female employees who might be pregnant, but also the crews, their teams, the crew leaders, the supervisors, making sure that we're all on the same page and we're helping the member out as best as possible, and we're being accommodating as we need to. And then we want to look at cancer prevention and reduction, ways to improve our overall incumbent physical process for our members, looking at the educational materials to include effects for the unborn child and reproductive health, kind of like Sarah was talking about earlier in her presentation, also including educational material and making sure we have that existing and reinforced relationship with our OC health providers. But also, like Sarah said, we want to make sure that we have educational members for the members' private physicians and their doctors. So with that, I see us having a lot of interaction with Dr. Janke moving forward, minus what she's already working on with Assistant Chief Costin. So I truly see a lot of work there, a lot of research on the different studies, reaching out to our neighboring and other jurisdictions on what they're doing successfully, getting their input on things that can help us do better. Then also with our HR section, we need to look at recruitment and retention. And that's another thing that Sarah hit on as something that we need to look at, along with logistical support. We just went through a 3-year structural PPE study. We do sizing, custom sizing for our career members, but we need to make sure that, like with one of our members we were talking, is that do we have the right suspenders to fit her body type? So if we don't, then we need to have a plan in place to work with the manufacturer to make sure that we address that. Other things such as helmet design and station uniforms. So those are the things that we've somewhat have addressed through our current contracts, but we want to make sure moving forward we're doing the right things, and those appropriate committees are addressing that as we move forward. We know that this is going to be a huge ordeal and undertaking for our department and in our committees. Some of these topics we think that we might be able to address relatively quickly and then put things in place. But also we know that some of these projects and some of these topics are going to take a long time. Fortunately, Chief Keen, who's going to be taking my spot in April, he's already been briefed. He's going to be the committee chair, so he'll be providing oversight to the group leaders. And then from there, he'll be responsible for keeping Assistant Chief Costin, Chief Williams, and Chief Johnson abreast of what's going on, progress, struggles, assistance they may need. And then also, as we work through these studies and going through research, if there's male-specific items such as andropause that we need to address, we need to make sure that that's being included as well. So, Brenda, that's pretty much a quick down and dirty, but I just want to, hopefully I didn't rush it. But we want to take this seriously. We know that's the right thing to do. We know that we have some deficiencies. We know that we do have some things in place, but we want to do better, and we want to be doing the right thing for our female members, both career and volunteer.
Thank you, Chief. No, you did a good, this, like I said at the very beginning, we have a very mixed group of people involved today. And so obviously we're hearing what happens with the women's health, but we also need to think about the big picture and what the leaders of organizations need to consider when something comes up in the organization, and policies and procedures is ultimately what we have to bring to the table. So thank you for that. The reason I had invited you to speak for everybody to understand is that there obviously is a lot to the layers of it all, as we can tell. That's why we're talking on this, and there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. So we are sort of off track, and that's fine, because I kind of wanted to be flexible. What I wanted to go into the breakout rooms, but I think people are going to have questions first. So depending on how many questions, we may skip the breakout rooms altogether. So I don't know. I do, before I would say anything else, Sarah, if at some point somebody asked in the chat if you could give your information again and put that on the screen so everybody can write that down. Also, Mark, I'll let you, I know you had a question real quick. And if anybody else has a question, if you want to put your hand up, and then I'll call on you.
I have about 65 questions.
All right, you only get one.
I'm only going to do one of each. A lot of great information, Dr. Janke. Really appreciate this. The comment I already made in the chat, I think, was just the idea with the volunteers. The only thing that comes to mind is that adrenaline cortisol dump, that maybe it becomes a little more balanced out for a career member who's kind of in sets and reps and used to going out, 5 times, 8 times, getting called at dark. So maybe that rebound or that dump is not as significant as somebody who maybe gets fewer of them. And I mean, we know some of that sleep pattern stuff that happens to our members when they get rousted at dark anyways is already pretty significant, but maybe it's even more for the volunteer member. That was more a comment in answering that. And then the one thing you talked about, decision-making being part of this, it just really hit a chord, because as part of our conflict management training, we incorporated a scenario, which was an outgrowth of an actual situation which evolved in spite of our great policy. And I say that somewhat sarcastically. It's a good policy, but at the end of it, until the culture part changes, great policy is always trumped by culture. We had a situation, and so within our conflict management training, we incorporated that decision-making scenario effectively for that newer officer to have them understand what that member's going through when they say, hey, do I come off the line? What's the best way to do this, and put people in that situation to figure that out. So more a comment than necessarily a question, but all good stuff. And looking at it from a training perspective, there's just so much stuff that we have to move on here. So thank you very much.
Sarah, do you have?
That you mentioned about just having other women available to have that conversation, and especially, and that's why I think it's important to also work between organizations, because so many departments, especially smaller departments, have 1 or 2 women who maybe they are the only woman that's ever been pregnant at the department, or so some of that information sharing I think will be amazing. And I put my email and cell in the chat, so if anyone needs it there, and if you want to be added to the list, I'll just forward that on.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Otherwise, I will have us go into the chat rooms. Is there any other? No? Okay, good. Well, then I guess it kind of puts us on track. It doesn't really give us a lot of time. I feel maybe we could get a good 15 minutes in the chat rooms. I hope people will stick around for this, because this is, I think, another very important part of it. We have like 7 rooms created. So at this point, we have it sort of focused hopefully on some specific questions, and depending on how that goes, you can break it out accordingly, but please participate as you would. And at the end, I would like to bring everybody back together, because I do have some really cool announcements about some upcoming training and some final thoughts. So at this point, let's pray this works, but I'm going to have us open all rooms.
Come back at